Hi, I'm Dr. Asegun Henry, and I'm a professor in mechanical engineering at MIT. Recently, I created a YouTube channel called Ask a Real Scientist that will address issues related to science, technology, and engineering. The initial focus is going to be on topics where there's a significant amount of misinformation propagated on social media, or there's significant misunderstanding in the general public. The goal is to educate the public and to increase scientific literacy so that people can make the best decisions for themselves, their families, their communities, and so people can begin to advocate for the best social, economic, and government policies. The series began with the first episode on COVID-19 and this pandemic. And since it was a topic that was far outside my expertise, instead of teaching about it myself, I decided to instead interview a colleague. This second episode, however, is about a topic that has been getting a lot of attention on social media, and it's specifically about the potential health threats associated with 5G wireless radiation. This topic happens to be close enough to my expertise that I'm going to do this one myself. So this episode is going to be longer than most of the episodes I do in the future, and that's because there's a significant amount of controversy around this issue. And I've spent the last few days learning about it, and there's just a lot that I have to explain, a lot that I have to walk you through to give you some baseline understanding. So I want to first give you an outline of what I'm going to cover in this episode so that you can have an overall feel for what we're going to go through. I want to first give some background about the issue itself and my perspective on conspiracy theories in general. After that, I want to give you some overarching conclusions that I came to. This is specifically for the people who don't have time to go through the details and are just interested in taking my word for it. Once we get through all that, I'm going to dive into the bigger conspiracy theory that's been floating around, which in short is very ridiculous, and I don't plan to give it a lot of time. But after that, though, I want to spend the majority of the time digging into the more potentially realistic issue of the claims that there are some health hazards associated with the radiation emitted from fifth generation 5G wireless networks. In order to understand the research that's been done, I have to first teach you about what light is itself. Once you understand what light is and what radiation is, specifically the underlying physics at play, then a lot of the studies that have been done are going to make more sense to you. And so after we do that, I'm going to give you some high-level guidance on how you can think about the research in this field, and I'll explain to you what I was thinking specifically. After all that, I'm then going to give you my high-level perspective after myself taking some time to read the literature, and I'm going to go into some specific examples of papers that I read, which will clarify for you, I think, how I came to have the perspective that I have now. Then I'm going to restate my conclusions, and hopefully, if people have questions or comments, we can continue the discussion online in any platform where you happen to see this video posted. So let me first begin with a few thoughts about conspiracy theories in general. In short, I can understand how and why people really take conspiracy theories seriously, and the reason is because there have been a bunch of examples where conspiracy theories actually turned out to be true. For example, there's the Tuskegee experiment, the role that, for example, the United States government played in undermining groups and movements in this country, like the Communist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Black Panthers. Then there are conspiracies that, have been put forth by companies, such as the tobacco companies, and their push to suppress the evidence that smoking tobacco actually causes cancer. Then you also have like oil companies putting out propaganda to bring about doubt around the realities of climate change. It's because these things have happened in the past, and that many people no longer really trust the mainstream media. People don't trust what they're told by the government, and they definitely don't trust what they're told by companies, particularly when it comes to health. And so it's because of all these like egregious violations of trust that have happened throughout recent history that many people don't know what to believe. And it's so often so difficult to know who or what sources you can trust. I get it. It's difficult. And I'm a skeptic by nature, and I think you should be too. That said, I think it's important to realize now that we live in a new era where people, organizations, groups, they profit from this fear and this uncertainty. People spread misinformation, sometimes for attention, sometimes because they honestly think they know the truth, but they don't. You got to recognize that we now live in an era where people can make videos and posts online giving the impression of expertise, but sometimes they have no expertise whatsoever to speak of. And they can prey on the seeds of distrust that have been sown by all the institutions that we should, in an ideal world, have the ability to trust. So that said, just because a liar tells lies, it does not mean that they will never say anything true. So as the general public, we have to develop our own independent ability to discern truth from falsehood. We have to become knowledgeable ourselves on a variety of topics so that we can make the best decisions for our lives, for those that we care about. Let me clarify that this does not mean everybody has to become an expert. That's not what I'm saying. In making these videos, that's not my expectation. However, I do believe that people are capable of having a much more firm and rigorous, very basic understanding of some things. And without necessarily having to do the math or be able to do or work through all the details, people can have a basic understanding that allows them to understand what to believe and how they should make the decisions. And that's largely the reason I created this series, because teaching and translating complicated concepts to the layperson has really become one of my own personal specialties. So with that disclaimer, I want to begin with my conclusions up front on these two conspiracy theories, or these two issues. So as I've seen it discussed and presented online, there seem to be like two sets of claims or concerns about 5G. 5G simply stands for fifth generation wireless or cell phone technology. The first idea that somehow the first conspiracy is that somehow we are experiencing a pandemic right now associated with COVID-19, but somehow the conspiracy is that it's actually not caused by an actual virus, but it's somehow instead caused by the radiation associated with cell phone signals. The second issue has to do with concerns that 5G radiation may not be safe, may cause health problems for people, and particularly in the long term. On the first issue, I have to say the idea itself is quite preposterous. I rarely get to use that word, but I had several people send me a video where someone was actually claiming this, and quite honestly, I was surprised that so many people were taking it seriously at all. But in many ways, this really just underscores the whole point of this series. There's so much basic scientific knowledge that is lacking, and it's difficult. It's actually really easy to get one over on people because they don't know these very basic things. So my short conclusion on this issue is that it's categorically false. The pandemic we're experiencing right now is caused by a new novel coronavirus, severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, coronavirus 2, SARS-CoV-2, and it causes a disease that we now call COVID-19, and because it started in 2019. And we know that people are dying from this disease because people that have died in multiple places, they've taken samples of their respiratory tract, saw that the cells were infected with the same pathogen because it has the same DNA. And so we're very clear that this is definitely caused by a virus. There's no real physical mechanism that would explain why 5G communication signals would all of a sudden start killing people. And I'll go into that in a bit more detail, but this conspiracy theory is categorically false. On the second issue of whether or not the electromagnetic radiation from 5G networks is harmful to human beings, I would say I have not seen anything in the scientific literature yet that really conclusively shows that there's definitely an effect or a safety concern. At the same time, there is literature that suggests or indicates that there are safety concerns, but I don't consider them conclusive and have not seen any strong claims of such in the literature that are conclusive and specifically can point to causality, saying that the radiation is what caused it. Nonetheless, there are a number of reports that suggest it is possible and therefore it should not be ruled out. Given the amount of study that has gone into this issue already, millions of dollars invested in studying this, and it's rather nuanced, there's a lot of complexity. There seems to be a really long, lacking strong consensus amongst the community that there's any severe consequences. So, for example, there are some papers citing increases in the amount of cancers. These are epidemiological studies. They show like increases of like factors of 2, so going from like 0.07%, 0.007% to 0.014%, for example. But they don't seem to be like large order of magnitude increases. And although many studies conclude with a lot of conjecture that there may be an issue, or it seems quite possible, this field may actually never reach a conclusion about this. So that said, there seem to be some overstated claims in the media, and I have not seen anything suggesting that we're in any immediate danger or clear danger even in the long term. So with those conclusions stated up front, let's go ahead and quickly deal with this first conspiracy in more detail. The claim, which I heard made in a video that was posted on Facebook and somebody sent it to me, was that we're being told by the government that this is COVID-19 and it actually is sickness and death caused by 5G cell phone network radiation. Again, this idea is simply false. But if you're someone who doesn't know the basic physics about electricity and magnetism, I suppose most people on Earth actually don't. So I can see how someone saying this might actually seem plausible. Nonetheless, if you stay tuned until much later in this video where I go over what electromagnetic radiation actually is, you'll see why this doesn't really make sense. So again, here are the reasons you know this is false. The SARS-CoV-2 virus, which causes the COVID-19 disease, has been in the respiratory tracts of different people who've died around the world, and it's currently being studied so that its behavior can be better understood and hopefully some form of vaccine or treatment can be developed. There are research papers being published on it right now, and scientists and medical doctors are sharing samples and data around the world to try and save lives. So that's number one. That's how you know this is truly a disease. This is truly a real virus. Radiation from cell phones, number two, is its effect on animals and human beings has been studied. It's been studied thoroughly. To my knowledge, there has never been any report or claims that it would cause any immediate death at the amplitudes and fluxes associated with cell phone communications. It's like not even close. There are questions being raised about whether or not there may be some very long-term effects over periods, longer than 10 years, but nothing has been conclusive or proven, and it certainly doesn't cause people to develop an immediate respiratory set of symptoms that we're seeing with COVID-19. In addition to this, I'm going to play a few clips from one of the videos that I was sent, and I'm going to note several claims that are false in the video itself.
What's really occurring with coronavirus? This is going to be difficult for people to accept, but let me tell you categorically, factually, and scientifically, coronavirus is not the problem. It is questionable whether it is even a contagion in the context of a disease that is spreading from person to person. What we're seeing are symptoms of a virus. What we are not aware of what's causing those symptoms. So this has nothing to do with a biological warfare or any other kind of stuff that you might be hearing swirling around on the internet. What this is our bodies reacting to what is known as radio spectrum radiation or radio frequency radiation. And so I know that sounds bizarre, but let me tell you scientifically what is happening. And then I knew a long time ago that 5G was dangerous, but I didn't understand the correlation with the coronavirus, which I now do. And I want to be able to explain that to you. The frequency that they're using, which is 10 times faster than 4G, unfortunately, when it comes into connection with human bodies, causes cell poisoning. Cell poisoning. So 5G, the frequency and the power, which is 10 times more powerful than 4G, is reacting adversely with human cells.
So here, the person says 5G is 10 times more powerful. This is not true. It's 10 times higher frequency, but there are international guidelines on power. So Most notably, cell phone radiation is supposed to stay below about 1 milliwatt per square centimeter, and despite the higher frequency, the power is still below this limit, so it's not 10 times more powerful.
This coronavirus was supposedly meant to start in some fish market. That is complete nonsense. It started as a result of radioactive or radio frequencies at a high level, creating radiation that was toxic to cells, and that's why people were falling over, dying.
Here, the person makes a slip of the tongue actually and says radioactive. This, I think, is actually probably the main source of confusion. I'll deal with this in more detail later. Once I explain what electromagnetic radiation actually is, but suffice it to say, it is very different from something being radioactive. Radioactive materials are something completely different, and they definitely can kill you. These are the special materials, for example, that are used in nuclear power plants that experience radioactive decay. If you're exposed to too much of their radiation, then sickness and death can definitely occur. But it seems the person making this video has conflated the two things, and it's almost as if they're using 5G cell phone radiation as to mean the same thing as a radioactive material or radioactive radiation.
They are using coronavirus to try and hide the fact that people are dying from the 5G frequency. So let me just explain. Other major cities that rolled this out, it takes 6 months for this to impact your physical body. So
here he says it takes 6 months for it to impact the body, and there's no evidence of this anywhere. This is simply a false claim. It's never backed up anywhere in the video. He just makes kind of false statements, says that it's scientifically proven.
And trust me, they're moving at lightning speed. Within a matter of weeks, we are going to be shocked by the revelation and the implementation of the things that they will be doing. The vaccines will be a matter of months away, if not days.
Here he says that the vaccines will be here in a matter of months, if not days. A lot of technological advancement has gone into speeding up the time it takes to develop a vaccine. And it has now truly been reduced to a few months to do like a design of a vaccine. However, this is just the time it takes to do the design. Once it's designed, it still has to get tested on animals and humans. You have to have clinical trials, and this is the slowest step. Even though a new vaccine may be ready for testing in as short as maybe 4 months or so, the clinical trials will take at least that long, if not much longer. For example, it took 20 months to develop the vaccine for SARS. Which is a little over a year and a half. So there will not be a vaccine available in days or a few months. Now, with that said, that concludes part 1 of this video on the conspiracy theory that COVID-19 is caused by 5G cell phone network radiation. But now I want to get started with part 2, which is about whether or not there are any harmful effects associated with 5G radiation. And as I've seen some discussion going around about this, there's one rather concerning aspect of it that really bothers me, which is that when I see people discussing this, many people do not actually seem to have an understanding of what electromagnetic radiation even is. The reason it's important to understand what it is because having that understanding will give you what we call in science physical intuition for how things are likely to behave. So let me first teach you what radiation is at a very fundamental level. Then we can talk about the studies that people have done to look at its health effects. So let's begin with atoms. Basically, all matter. You, everything around you, everything's made out of atoms, including the air you're breathing right now. You can think of an atom as a tiny little sphere. We now have microscopes that allow us to see individual atoms, and we're 100% clear they're real. Each atom, however, is composed of a combination of 3 other types of particles, protons, electrons, and neutrons. Now, what's interesting is that protons and electrons have another property called charge. Now, you might ask, well, what exactly is charge? Well, in short, we don't really have a much deeper understanding of what things like charge are to be able to tell you what it is per se. What we can tell you is what we know about how it interacts with other things. And this really highlights an important aspect of physics, which is that if you keep asking, well, what is that? And what is that? And what is that? Over and over and over, eventually you'll reach the end of our understanding. And all we can tell you is that it's something we know exists because we understand how it's affected by other things. But that does not necessarily mean we can really tell you what it is on its own. And this is because physics is all about relationships. What matters is how it relates to other things. So we understand what something is by how it relates or how it influences or affects other things. And we can describe these relationships mathematically. But we can't necessarily tell you what anything really is on its own per se. So charge is one of these types of things. Charge is a physical property of matter that causes it to experience a force when it's exposed to something else called an electric field. And a charged particle, like a proton or electron, itself creates a non-zero electric field. So the electric field created by the one particle is felt or causes a force on other particles that are around it, and vice versa. So we understand this relationship, and there are two signs for charges, either positive or negative. Two particles with the same charge will experience forces that repel each other, push them apart, while two particles with opposite charges will experience forces that attract them together, bring them together. Now it's important to understand that the electric field changes, gets weaker the further away you are from an object, from a charged particle. It never fully goes to zero, but it can decrease to a point that it's so small it's essentially zero because the number is so small, the magnitude is so small. Nonetheless, the electric field of a particle extends out infinitely far. So you think of all space being a medium for the electric field. It exists everywhere in space. It's just that the value of the electric field at all locations is non-zero or could be changing. So in places where there's no atoms, like outer space, the magnitude of the electric field is really tiny. But if you're right next to a charged particle, it's much larger. And the point I'm trying to make is that the field exists everywhere. It exists in outer space. It's everywhere. It's inside you. It's in between all the atoms that make up your entire body. So now we have to consider a second and very important relationship in physics, which is the magnetic field. Most people have picked up a magnet before, so you know there's a force produced by the poles of a magnet. What you may not have appreciated, though, is that the magnetic field exists everywhere. It's just like the electric field. It's everywhere in space. But again, what changes is simply the size or the magnitude at a given location and a given time of the magnetic field. So in outer space, the field is almost zero. And next to a permanent magnet, like the one you might stick on your refrigerator, the field is non-zero. Now, what's interesting is that there's actually an interrelationship between the electric field and the magnetic field. And this is why we often abbreviate it as the electromagnetic field. They're independent things, meaning they are two distinctly different things. But what's interesting is they actually can affect each other. There's a relationship between them. Okay? This relationship is described by a set of equations called Maxwell's equations. Maxwell's equations show us that there's this reciprocal relationship between these two fields, all right? And most specifically, they teach us that whenever the value of the electric field is changing in time, anywhere in the universe, at any location, it will automatically induce or invoke a change in the magnetic field at the same location. Conversely, anytime there's a change in the magnetic field, it will induce a change in the electric field. Now, the relationship between them sounds like a very simple statement, and it is, but it has very far-reaching consequences. So what this means is that whenever a charged particle moves, which means its position or location changes in time, it will induce a change in the magnetic field as well. But then if the magnetic field changes, it correspondingly induces a change in the electric field again too. And then the electric field changes the magnetic field. The magnetic field changes the electric field, and they go back and forth in this cyclic push and pull indefinitely until something else happens. Now I'm going to show you some nice visuals from a really nice video I found on YouTube that explains this. But the basic point is that whenever a charged particle moves, and more specifically when it accelerates or decelerates, which just means it speeds up or it slows down, there is a perturbation or a disturbance that you can think of like a ripple that goes out into the electric field. And it correspondingly causes a ripple to go out in the magnetic field as well. Now, it's quite amazing to then learn that just like a water wave or a ripple through water, the ripple moves forward at a particular speed. That speed is the speed of light, okay? So it's one number, it's extremely fast, and in essence, it's the fastest thing in the universe. It moves at basically 300 million meters per second, or maybe in units you might be more familiar with, that's like 670 million miles per hour. It's so fast, it's hard to even conceive of anything that could be that fast, but it's nonetheless important to realize that it is not infinitely fast. It does in fact have a finite speed, and this also has very important consequences in physics that I'll touch on some other day in another video. But the main point I want to drive home is that this process of a wave going out, or a perturbation going out into space, which is a ripple in the electric field, and correspondingly induces a ripple in the magnetic field, this is what we call light. Light is just waves or perturbations in the electromagnetic field. All right? The electric field and magnetic field are coupled together. So when the electric field changes, it induces a change in the magnetic field, and the two go back and forth, and it propagates outward. That is light. This is the light that you see every day coming from the sun, coming out of light bulbs. Even you yourself are emitting light right now. These ripples are produced by atoms moving, or if you, for example, push electrons with electricity and have them move. So when electrons get accelerated by electricity, there's a perturbation that goes out in the electric field, and there's a corresponding ripple induced in the magnetic field. These two fields then do their dance back and forth at the speed of light, going back and forth. And the wave propagates at the speed of light. And this goes on, and it'll move through space until something can absorb it. And the absorption is basically how like a charged particle would feel that electric field that's moving, causing it to move. And in doing so, it would absorb the field. Okay, so the electric field produces a force on a charged particle that it can interact with, and this is how the light would get absorbed or stop propagating. So this is what light is. It's what we call electromagnetic radiation, and it's because of its ability to travel through space at the speed of light that we can use it to send information or messages. If I use some electricity or move a magnet to shake some electrons here, it'll send a ripple through the electromagnetic field, and it will keep going, just like light, as we've talked about. But eventually it may reach some electrons elsewhere, in another piece of metal somewhere, like an antenna. And when it receives this ripple that I sent out from over here, then the electrons over here in the antenna will move and do the same motion that I made the electrons do here. So it means I can cause motion of charged particles here, and I can replicate it somewhere else far away, because the electromagnetic field, that perturbation, will eventually travel and shake the electrons elsewhere. If we now take and ascribe some meaning to the motion of electrons in one location, that means we can now create a language, and we can send information from one location and have it received and replicated somewhere else. This process is the foundation of how wireless communication works. So let's now take a look at this nice video I found on YouTube that will give you some nice visuals, a nice mental picture of what is actually happening when a charged particle moves and it accelerates. You can see the electric field experience a kink or ripple, and you can see how it propagates outward at the speed of light. Where the electric field and the magnetic field do their back and forth dance, the change in the electric field causes a change in the magnetic field, then the change in the magnetic field causes a change in the electric field, and so on, back and forth, back and forth. They go forever until this ripple reaches another charged particle, and then it can possibly get absorbed.
In the modern world, we humans are completely surrounded by electromagnetic radiation. Have you ever thought of the physics behind these traveling electromagnetic waves? The great scientist Heinrich Hertz was the first man to transmit and detect electromagnetic waves. In his famous experiment, a high-voltage current was applied to the two ends of two metal wires, which generated a spark in the gap between them. This spark resulted in the radiation of electromagnetic waves. Those electromagnetic waves traveled through the air and created a spark in a metal coil located over a meter away.
So when the voltage was applied to the wires, that's the part where I said you use electricity to shake or move some electrons. In this particular experiment, the spark going across the gap between the two pieces of metal, the spark is the electrons moving. You actually see them moving back and forth. And what you see is the light coming out from their motion. The light is going out and hitting your eyes, which is why you can see the spark. That light also makes it over to the other part of the device, which has a gap. And it causes electrons on the other side to do the exact same thing, the same shape, the same motion.
If you had placed an LED in that gap, the bulb would have glowed. This was a clear case of electromagnetic wave propagation and detection.
Now that you're seeing it illustrated here as the light is two waves, you'll see that there's a light blue kind of teal looking sine wave going up and down, up and down. Then if you look carefully, there's also the exact same shape going left to right, but it's drawn in red. So there's a teal wave and there's a red wave. The red wave is the electric field moving back and forth, left and right. That's pushing the electrons back and forth. And the blue light, the blue sine wave, is the induced magnetic field that goes and does the exact same thing, but it's always in the perpendicular direction. The perpendicular direction comes straight from Maxwell's equations. The equations tell you that the magnetic field will change due to the change in the electric field, and they also tell you that what direction the field will change in, which is always perpendicular to the direction that the electric field is changing in, and vice versa.
Detection. However, before Hertz, the brilliant mathematician James Clerk Maxwell had already laid out the foundations for electromagnetic radiation by formulating 4 mathematical equations. However, these equations and the Hertz experiment raised a question: how do electromagnetic fields detach themselves from wires and propagate through a space? More specifically, what we need is a traveling electromagnetic wave and not a fluctuating one. Let's explore this logically. Consider an electric charge, which is moving at a constant speed. The electric field around it is shown. Now, imagine for a fraction of a second it accelerates. After that, it continues its uniform motion at a higher speed. What we need to understand is the effect of this acceleration on the electric field. The interesting thing is that the information does not travel at an infinite speed. Instead, it travels at the speed of light. Similarly, the information about the sudden variation of velocity of the charge does not get conveyed to the whole electric field region. The field near it knows about it, but the field far away still has no idea that the charge has accelerated and it is still in the old state. Let's separate out these regions with the help of 2 circles. Since the electric field cannot break, the field between these distances must transition. This transition field is known as a kink. The kink moves or radiates outwards at the speed of light. To show the kink animation in a clear way, let's move the camera along with the charge. We can say here that the acceleration of the charge has caused an electromagnetic disturbance or electromagnetic radiation. Based on this understanding, we will be able to understand the most important experiment in the field of antenna technology, the oscillating electric dipole. The interesting fact about this simple oscillating dipole is that it produces electromagnetic radiation in a perfectly sinusoidal manner. Let's see how it is achieved. Before getting into the electromagnetics, let's understand how velocity and acceleration vary in this simple case. It is clear that at both ends the velocities should be 0, and in the middle the velocity should be at the maximum. This means that this is a case of continuous acceleration and deceleration. The electric field pattern is drawn here when the chargers are far apart and when the velocity is 0. In order to have a better understanding, let's examine one of the electric field lines. Let's observe the electric field line at t by 8. You can see that the electric field line is deformed. The reason for this deformation is simple. This time period is the region with the highest acceleration. As we saw earlier, accelerating or decelerating charges cause kinks in the electric field. In short, the old electric field does not get adjusted to the new field very well. This deformation is continuous since there is continuous acceleration in the charge. When 2 charges meet at the central point, the deformed line also meets there. After that, it detaches and radiates. This radiation travels at the speed of light. If you plot an electric field intensity variation with respect to length, you can see that the radiation we have produced is perfectly sinusoidal in nature. Please note that this varying electric field will automatically generate a varying magnetic field perpendicular to it.
So what you're seeing on the screen at this point is a picture of a positive charge and a negative charge moving back and forth. If you move electrons back and forth on an antenna, it basically produces this same effect. Instead of having a separate positive charge, what you have is a region with less negative charge, and it's effectively the same thing because it's just relative. It's all about the fact that you have more negative charge in one region than you do have in another. So if you cause the electrons to slosh and move back and forth in this cyclic pattern as shown, the electrons are constantly accelerating. Thus, that means they're constantly producing radiation. And the orange colored line showing the sine wave, going up and down, is just the value or the magnitude of the electric field at a given location in time.
Now, let's have a look at how this applies to an antenna. A time-varying voltage is applied to the metal wire as shown. Due to the effect of the voltage, the electrons will be displaced from right to left and create positive and negative charges. With a continuous variation of voltage, the positive and negative charges will shuttle back and forth in the wire. This simple arrangement is known as a dipole antenna.
In this illustration, the little white circles are electrons, and they are being pushed around by the applied electric field, or the applied voltage moving them. We can come back to better understand electricity another day, but for now, just take it as granted that we have the ability to move electrons back and forth as it's shown using electricity.
The dipole antenna produces the same radiation as we saw in the previous section. In this case, the antenna works as a transmitter. The frequency of the transmitted signal will be the same as the frequency of the applied voltage signal.
Now we're going to come back to this issue of frequency in a little bit because it's important, but for now just think about it this way. The speed at which you shake the electrons back and forth, meaning how many times they go from up and down or left to right, as it's shown in the image, that is called its frequency. It's a measure of how frequently the electrons are being moved back and forth. So if it goes slow, this is a low frequency. If they go very fast, back and forth, that's a high frequency. So if, for example, they could go back and forth really slowly every 5 seconds, that would be a really low frequency, or they can move much, much faster than I can actually move my hands and get to very, very high frequencies, multiple oscillations for every second. The number of times that they oscillate back and forth every second is called the frequency. It's typically measured in hertz. 1 hertz means 1 oscillation down and back every second. 10 hertz would mean the electrons are moving 10 times every second. I can't move my hands that fast. But these frequencies get really high, so they can go, 1,000 times every second would be 1,000 hertz, which would be a kilohertz, as we call it. We use the prefix kilo. If we're talking about frequency and going up to millions of times back and forth every second, that would be megahertz. And when we start talking about 5G, cell phone signals, those are up in the gigahertz regime. So we're talking about electrons moving back and forth billions of times every second. And that's abbreviated gigahertz, GHz. Now, it should be appreciated here that there is no intrinsic bound on frequency in physics. There is no such thing as a maximum frequency for light. It can go to terahertz, trillions of cycles per second, or infinitely far beyond that. Similarly, it can go infinitely slow too, as close to zero as you want. But we'll get more into that shortly.
The same antenna can act as a receiver if the operation of the antenna is reversed. When propagating electromagnetic waves strike the antenna, the oscillating fields of waves create positive and negative charges at the ends of the antenna. The varying charge accumulation means a varying voltage signal is produced at the center of the antenna. This voltage signal is the output when the antenna works as a receiver. We can note here that for perfect transmission or reception, the length of the antenna should be half of the wavelength. This is the first antenna design criterion for proper reception or transmission.
So here we see another property of light I want to point out, which is its wavelength. Since all light moves exactly at the same speed, which is the speed of light, regardless of its frequency, there's a reciprocal property called its wavelength. So if you were to take the oscillations in the electric field, measure how far apart they are to go one cycle. If you actually measure the length of the cycle in distance, that would be its wavelength. So in physics, we generally use frequency and wavelength interchangeably. So you should know that in case you ever see this written down somewhere. So there's one last property of light that you have to understand for this whole issue of 5G, which is what we term the amplitude. A wave of light has a frequency, a wavelength, and a speed, but it also has an amplitude. Amplitude is key. The amplitude is how large the electric field and the magnetic field become. For example, think of a wave of water. You could have a very low frequency wave that's only 1 foot tall, or you could have the same low frequency wave and it could be a tidal wave or a tsunami. All right. The size or the height, the magnitude of the wave is what we call its amplitude. Frequency represents how fast the oscillations occur in time, but the amplitude is how big the wave is. So for example, the more force you use to push the electrons and shake them, the bigger the electric field perturbation will be, and the higher the amplitude of the light that will go out. In our discussion going forward, amplitude is going to be a critical property of light that you have to appreciate in order to understand if a particular frequency of light can actually affect you or not. For example, a light bulb or LED can put out visible light that has basically the same kind of frequencies you see coming from the sun, but staring at a street light from far away won't hurt your eyes. But if you stare at the sun, which is 93 million miles away, it will. So what's the difference? Well, it's the amplitude of the light. A street light is much lower intensity, and therefore it sends out light that we can see, but at much lower amplitude than the sun. Here, it's important to appreciate that the light itself carries energy with it. The energy that it took to move the charged particles and generate the light is exactly equal to the amount of energy carried by the light. So by this, I mean that whenever the light went out, it got its energy from electrons moving somewhere, or I should say charged particles moving somewhere. The light then carries that energy with it, and since energy can't be created or destroyed, the energy contained in the light is fixed, and it doesn't change as it moves through space. What does change, however, is the surface area over which the light is spread or projected. When light propagates out from a source, the total energy it has is being spread over a larger and larger area as it moves away from the object, moves away from the source. This is why light seems to be less intense as you move away from it, and it gets dimmer, or appears to be dimmer. It's not so much that it's dimmer as much as the same amount of energy is being projected over a larger and larger area. So the amount of energy that you're receiving per unit time from that source is getting lower and lower. This concept is critical to understand because the amplitude and how much energy you're being hit with from cell phone networks is actually very small. And there are limits set by organizations that I'll talk about on how much you can safely be exposed to. To understand the difference between low intensity or low amplitude light and high intensity, high amplitude light, consider an example of a laser. The frequency of the light, for example, could just be red, which is like 400 terahertz. Could be exactly the same for a laser used as a weapon that would melt a piece of metal, and for a laser that you could use as a laser pointer on a screen. All right. The frequency could be the exact same, but the case is different for the amplitude. The amplitude is dramatically different. As a result, the amount of power being carried by the light in the two cases is very different. The laser pointer is low power, only a few milliwatts, meaning a few thousandths of a watt, all right, less than 1 watt. On the other hand, the laser could be 10,000 watts or 100,000 watts. So the amount of power carried by the light is crucial to know in order to understand how it's going to affect things. So now that you understand, hopefully understand at a very basic level, what electromagnetic radiation is, you might be thinking that you don't want any man-made radiation hitting your body. But the reality is light or electromagnetic radiation, I'm using these terms interchangeably, is all around you all the time. You yourself right now are emitting electromagnetic radiation. Most of it is at about 28 terahertz. We can't see it with our eyes. That's the reason you may not appreciate that you're emitting it, but it is there. And this brings me to one of the last things I want to make sure that you know about light, which is that electromagnetic radiation can exist at essentially any frequency. And all electromagnetic radiation is the same in the sense that it's all waves or perturbations to the electromagnetic field. This is important because I think one source of confusion that many people have is this term radiation itself. Like when you say radiation, people hear radiation, I think maybe they immediately think it's bad for them, like radiation from something that's radioactive that can kill you, right? Very easily, but it's a completely different phenomena from light, okay? In physics, the term radiation is rather widely used to simply denote that something is being emitted, it's going out from somewhere. But there are different things that can be emitted. There's different types of radiation. In the case of radioactive materials, it could actually be neutrons. It's actual subatomic particles that have mass, and so something is literally hitting you and can cause damage to your cells. Electromagnetic radiation is different because it's just a perturbation to the electromagnetic field. One thing that's important, though, is to appreciate that light or electromagnetic radiation is typically classified and given other subclassifications based on how it interacts with matter. So as I mentioned before, we can't see light we can't see the light that we are emitting right now. It's because it's in the infrared part of the spectrum. The reason we can't see it is because the photoreceptors in the photoreceptor cells in our eyes are unaffected by infrared light. And so this means that they don't absorb light from those frequencies very well. Thus, we don't get a signal to our brain, and so we don't see it. But even though we can't see it, it's still hitting our eyes and it's still there. It just doesn't register with those cells. And as a result, we can't see it, but other organisms like snakes actually can. So some snakes have evolved so that their eyes actually can see at night and they can see infrared radiation. They can see at those frequencies. This is exactly how night vision goggles work. They have photosensors that respond to infrared light that we are tuned to the same frequencies that we are emitting right now. So there are several different classifications of light, and the classifications are generally based on how they interact with different types of matter. So we call visible light the frequencies that our eyes can see. We call those frequencies visible light. The ones that are a little bit higher than the color violet, we call those ultraviolet light. This is the part of the spectrum from the sun that we use sunscreen to absorb so we don't get sunburn. We call the frequencies that are around 300 petahertz, we call those X-rays. X-rays will go straight through your body tissue, but they do get absorbed by your bones. Then even higher than that, we have what are called gamma rays. Gamma rays are so high frequency they can actually knock and kick an electron off of an atom. That's what we call ionizing radiation. Right? So even at really small amplitudes, the light in that frequency range is actually so energized you can actually ionize an electron or ionize an atom. So now moving in the other direction, at lower frequencies of light, below what we can see, we first have infrared, which you are emitting right now. This is also like where your TV remote control emits light so it can communicate with your TV. Then below that, we got microwaves, which are, of course, used in microwave ovens and also satellite communications. And then below that is radio waves, which, of course, are used for radio stations, but they're also used for Wi-Fi and cell phones. Now, the new thing that with 5G is that they're pushing cell phone communications to higher frequencies, similar to what's used for satellites. And the reason is because it can be faster. All light moves at the same speed of light, but one reason it's faster is because it gives cell phones a wider range of frequencies that can be used, so it opens up more channels for communication so that one device doesn't have to wait in line to send its message. Instead, it can just hop on a different frequency and quickly transmit so that you don't have so many bandwidth limitations. This allows more devices to communicate at the same time. And reduces latency. So now one interesting aspect of 5G being at higher frequencies is actually that the higher frequency light is actually unable to penetrate as deeply into the body. Lower frequencies, such as the ones used in 2G, 3G, 4G cell phone networks, that actually could go deeper into the body. 5G can only penetrate a couple of millimeters, and it's mostly absorbed on the skin or the cornea of your eyes. For this reason, For this reason, 5G towers and equipment have to be installed at smaller intervals because the signal can't get into buildings as easily, meaning that it's got shorter range. Now, I've seen some people say that this means, therefore, radiation will be more intense because there's more towers. But it does not necessarily mean that, because the power they are restricted to is still the same. So people are these same frequencies are still limited to about 1 milliwatt per square centimeter of projected onto your surface of your body. So where this limit came from is that this is roughly the amount of power that would cause your body temperature or your skin temperature to rise about 1 degree Celsius. So basically, cell phone radiation is limited to powers lower than what would be able to actually make you feel like you're being heated. Now, for comparison, consider the amount of light you're emitting right now at even higher frequencies. Right now, you're emitting about 5 milliwatts per square centimeter, which is 5 times higher than the limit for cell phones. You yourself are emitting light 5 times higher power than the light that we're talking about for 5G radiation. So just walking around and being around other people causes you to get exposure to light at higher power than what you're receiving from cell phone communications. So this is why I said it's important to understand the amplitude and the power carried by the light. This gives you some physical intuition so you can understand why it's not so obvious. I mean, clearly we walk around and radiate light to each other, radiate light to the objects around us. They are radiating to us, but clearly that radiation is not causing health problems. And so that's why I say it's important to go through this, because it may give you some physical intuition as to what seems reasonable or what you would expect with other light. So now that we've established all that, we can now engage this question of whether or not 5G or other cell phone radiation is somehow harmful to human beings. The key question here is, does electromagnetic radiation at the frequencies used for cell phones and also the amplitudes or power densities used for cell phones, is it harmful to humans? I phrased the question this way because of my example of the laser pointer. There's no doubt in my mind that there exists a sufficiently high amplitude and power density that can cause problems at virtually any frequency. Okay. The key question is whether it's harmful at or below the power density guidelines set forth by the governing agencies. And one of the key governing agencies here, or governing organizations, is the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, or ICNIRP, ICNIRP. And everything that I read, all the literature, I found that actually ICNIRP's review and justification for their guidelines was one of the best documents I could find. If you want to find it, just Google ICNIRP guidelines, and you should be able to find the PDF. I found their review to be one of the most sensible, rational, well-reasoned documents I could find on this topic, and I think it's really worth noting here some high-level comments on this area of literature before we dig in. So I need to first talk about the fact that I think research in this area is really fraught with conflicts of interest. There are some people are funded by entities with a vested interest in showing that there are no effects. Some seem to be on a crusade to show that there must be some kind of effect. Sometimes it seems like people are cherry-picking data to make their case. I'm not sure if they're motivated by potentially gaining some notoriety or ringing the alarm, but in the cases I've looked at, I do not see how any alarm is really justified. And for those that are not familiar with this term, cherry-picking data, that's a term we use in science to mean that someone's basically being selective of what data they consider. They're not looking at everything in a balanced way. They're instead just selecting evidence that supports their own preconceived conclusions or their own bias. With that said, I think it's important to also state explicitly that I don't believe I have any conflicts of interest here. I don't work on any cell phone related research. I'm not currently funded by any cell phone companies. I did have a project from Intel funded back in 2013, but that project's ended for several years now. I don't have any potential right now to get any additional funding from them again, such that, and there's nothing that I'm going to say here that would affect me professionally, either negatively or positively. So I don't really think, I think I'm rather neutral to this field in general. My analysis here is really rooted just in my understanding of the underlying physics and my review of some of the literature I've been able to read on the topic. I want to state very clearly, I do not claim to have read everything, but I felt comfortable making this video after reading enough that I felt like I got a good sense for what's been done. This is not to say that I have not missed anything. I most certainly have missed a lot of literature. I've not read a ton. And if you feel that there's something that contradicts my claims, I invite you to please share it so I can review it. As a scientist, I always reserve the right to later change my conclusions if new or contradictory or more convincing evidence emerges or it's brought to my attention. Nonetheless, in science, we reach a consensus when we have a mechanistic understanding of what's going on, and or there have been repeated instances where a hypothesis cannot be disproven. From what I've gleaned from reading some of the literature on this is not true for the hypotheses put forth regarding the health or safety concerns with 5G or other cell phone radiation. I need to also say that I am not an expert on this specific area, so the biology and some of those things are not my expertise, but I was able to teach myself enough to get through, I think, the salient points from reading the literature. So you might ask yourself, why should you listen to me? I would say it's because I do understand the basic physics. I do not understand all aspects of the biology, but I do get the basic ideas, and I was able to read and understand the literature. And I read, and everything that I read, I was able to understand it. This is because I'm formally trained as a scientist. I have more than 15 years experience reading scientific literature of this type, of this nature. Taken and gotten good grades in formal courses in subjects like physics, physics of electricity and magnetism, chemistry, amongst other things. And I myself teach advanced courses on energy and heat transfer. So many other people in my position who are even better experts at this, they are and they should be busy doing their work. I'm just trying to make some extra time to teach the general public because I think this somebody's got to do it, and I think it'll be really impactful for the world to spend this time to explain some of these things. My hope is that this will inspire other experts to get interested in doing similar things, similar efforts, and we'll do a better job of disseminating more of what we know to the public at large in a way that's understandable by the layperson. Yet it can still retain enough accuracy to be rigorous. So now let's get back to 5G. For perspective on this issue, I think it's useful to have some context to understand some of the history and where some of these claims originated. We're talking about electromagnetic radiation and its effects on human health, and 5G is not the first time people have made these kinds of claims. People have been studying this actually since the 80s. And I actually want to show a really nice video, really nice piece done by the New York Times that talks about how a lot of this started. The reason I think this is a great example is because in the video you get to that I'm going to show you, you get to see one of the main people who rang the alarm. He's an epidemiologist at Brown, this guy named David Savitz. And in this video, he talks about how he did one of the first studies that brought attention to this. But later, as more studies were done and there was a bigger data set, he realized that they were wrong. And I want people to see this because I want people to see that scientists, at least the good ones, do not mind admitting they were wrong. We don't claim to always have it right, but we do claim to have a commitment to getting it right, even if we have to go back and negate what we said before. The problem, however, is that this is not necessarily the case with the news or the general public. So, as the video also talks about how once this fear got into the general public that there was a possibility put in people's minds that maybe electromagnetic radiation actually causes these problems, it's really difficult to ever get that out of people's minds. In short, what I'm going to discuss in regards to cell phone radiation, 5G, is similar to the case of power lines and radiation coming from power lines.
We have a report tonight about an unattractive part of the country's landscape that may also be hazardous to your health.
In the late 1980s, News reports that electromagnetic fields from power lines could spark a cancer epidemic
New and troubling evidence.
had the public and the power companies running scared.
Is there a cancer risk associated with electric power lines?
Magnetic fields may cause cancer, especially in children.
This may be as significant as anything that's happened since the understanding that smoking causes cancer.
Once something like this becomes part of our collective memory, there is no way to remove it from that memory.
Suspicion that power lines posed some kind of invisible health threat had been brewing before scientists looked at the question seriously.
A new high-voltage line over Minnesota farmland has people so angry, they've even written a song.
This line is dangerous to us, to our families, and to our farm animals.
I think early on, the story was, isn't it amazing to consider that something that we ignored that seems so innocuous might be harmful?
David Savitz published one of the first rigorous field studies in 1987, measuring electromagnetic field levels in the homes of Denver children with cancer. The results were disturbing.
A recent study in Denver found that children who live in homes with higher magnetic fields are twice as likely to develop cancer as those who do not.
In the absence of a large body of research, each study is a breakthrough, is dramatic.
The potential danger from electromagnetic fields is making millions of human beings into test animals. That from author Paul Brodeur.
Studies show that these fields are extremely hazardous to human health.
A positive finding can result in an immediate reaction, sort of the moment of panic.
As electricity passes through power lines, it generates an electromagnetic field, or EMF.
A danger close to home and hard to get away from.
7 children here had cancer, and some parents suspect the high voltage lines near the elementary school.
America's love affair with electricity may have already produced an unintended tragedy of enormous proportions.
More than 2 decades later, the fear persists in many places where transmission towers cast shadows on backyards.
It used to be the biggest concern that I had was keeping them safe from the sun damage, and now I worry about exposing them to EMFs whenever we go outside.
Anne's husband, Dave Slapperud, tracks the EMF readings around the house.
It's bouncing up just around 10 to 27 back here. This is where the kids play.
But after decades of study, the man who helped put EMFs on the map believes the safety question has largely been answered.
Over time, as the body of research grew, the importance of our study overall diminished. The line of logic was that these fields are very common, and that the logical prediction would be that this would be a major public health problem. And that was simply wrong.
So why does the idea that power lines pose a major public health problem persist today?
Stop the power lines, save our property.
So would you want power lines running through your neighborhood or hanging over your head?
Some of it stems from the difficulty in interpreting evidence that's suggestive, yet also faint. Savitz and a few later researchers did find a small association between power lines and childhood leukemia, and this left some, like David Carpenter, convinced a serious hazard exists.
It doesn't mean that every child in a high magnetic field exposure is going to get leukemia, but it means twice as many as the background rate.
Childhood leukemia may be a dread disease, but it remains extremely rare, normally affecting about 1 in 20,000 children a year. Even if EMFs double the risk for highly exposed children, that number would be no more than 2 in 20,000. And with numbers that small, it's hard to know for sure if the studies are measuring any effect at all.
The likely impact of electromagnetic fields, if I had to pick a single number that is the most likely, it would be 0. That is, it's quite questionable whether these fields cause leukemia at all.
Epidemiology cannot answer the question, could there be a little risk? I think we can say without question that power lines, the fields from power lines, are not a major public health threat.
Scientists in the 1990s conducted hundreds of laboratory experiments, exposing human and animal cells to EMFs, looking for any way the fields might harm living tissue.
In 20 years of looking, no one has found a way that power line fields can do anything at all to cells or animals. And unless it can do something, there's no way it can cause cancer.
And that confirmed what many researchers have been saying since the National Academy of Sciences reviewed 500 studies on EMFs and made news with its verdict.
What they found was very reassuring.
The Blue Ribbon panel did not waffle in its conclusion. Electromagnetic radiation from power lines outside the home is not something we need to worry about.
Yet anxieties about power lines have found a seemingly permanent home in the popular imagination.
When you're looking for a new home, you don't always get the complete picture. But now there's homepages.com. Welcome to the neighborhood.
This risk really hit the sweet spot of what was going to make people afraid. This was just waiting to be whacked out of the park emotionally.
Ropeek says there is a reason the fear of power line EMFs has lodged itself so firmly in the public mind. Social scientists have described a set of factors that cause human beings to dread certain kinds of risks more than others. The list includes risks that people can't see or control, risks that could lead to suffering before death, and risks that might affect children. Sound familiar?
They're invisible and just about everywhere.
Do we play Russian roulette with people's children?
Should you be taking steps to keep your kids away from electromagnetic fields?
This had and has a long list of personality traits that make it really scary.
And whatever new, potentially reassuring information emerges, the memory of that invisible threat remains.
You never really get unscared about anything. Anything that rings that bell shakes that web of neurons in your brain, and that memory comes back. And that memory was formed with a little extra oomph because it was about survival.
When you're focusing on that bottom line of what can I do to improve my health, it comes down to a series of rather boring things about, wearing seatbelts and not smoking, not being overweight. And nobody wants to hear about those because they're so obvious and we already know those. We're always looking for the next frontier.
So let me give you a few examples of what I found in the literature, and I want to emphasize here that I specifically focused most of my attention on work or people that are saying that there's definitely a problem. The reason I did this is because I very quickly found the literature reviews saying that there's nothing conclusive, there's nothing here. But I wanted to give credence to the possibility that maybe some literature is being suppressed, or maybe there's the reports saying that there's no problem are just propaganda by cell phone companies so they can continue to profit. However, as you'll see in a lot of what I found, there are problems with saying that there is definitely a safety concern. So I found this slide deck by David Carpenter. He's the one that was in the New York Times video claiming that there's still a problem. It seems as though he's been advocating that there's a problem with electromagnetic radiation and human health for decades. There's also another guy I found, Joel Moskowitz, who has written some things on this topic and has even gotten some awards for his advocacy work in this area. Joel Moskowitz wrote a blog post in the Scientific American that said, we have no reason to believe 5G is safe. However, that post was followed a month or two later by another post, also on the same platform on Scientific American, that critiqued Moskowitz's claims, all right, and critiqued his representation of the conclusions in the literature. And this was written by another person named David Grimes. Since David Grimes already really addressed a lot of Moskowitz's claims in his own Scientific American article, I decided to focus on Carpenter's claims just to kind of pick him out as an example. So I went through Carpenter's slide deck, one that I found online, because I like the slide deck because it gives a lot of references, and I didn't have a chance to go through every single one, but I did look at some where he was making some pretty strong claims, and I found some issues where his claims, in my view, do not really match up with the actual results. So here's a link to the slide deck. I'll post that on the video, and let's go through it. So, for example, on slide 8, he shows this plot, and he credits something called the Next Up organization. I was not able to find the organization. In the plot, it seems that he's arguing that the radiation people have become exposed to over time has been increasing. It seems reasonable. And the plot ends at 2011, citing that people are exposed to 10,000 microwatts per square meter. This looks bad because he notes on the plot that the suggested exposure limit for health is down at 1,000 microwatts per square meter. However, if you look at the IC-NERP guidelines, this seems like some kind of mistake or typo. The IC-NERP guidelines set the limit at like 1 milliwatt per square centimeter. A milliwatt per square centimeter, a milliwatt per square meter is very different. It's like a difference of 10,000. So it's a big deal. So if you convert the units, the value that he has on his plot, 10,000 microwatts per square meter, near the top of the plot, is only 1 microwatt per square centimeter. This is 1,000 times lower than the IC-NERP guidelines. So from just looking at the plot and double checking what appears to be his claim, it didn't seem like it made sense. According to the data he's representing, seems like he's saying we're way over the limit, but to me, the data says we're actually 1,000 times below the limit. So this is like a clear example of where, when I look at the data, I actually see something very different than what's being claimed. If you keep going through the presentation, later down on slide 10, he cites this paper by Michelozzi and co-workers. The paper talks about how there's possibly a higher incidence of child leukemia in this region within about 10 kilometers of a radio station in Italy. This is the paper I mentioned earlier. Says in their analysis that the odds ratio was 2, meaning that in that region, around the radio station, there's a 2 times higher likelihood of a child getting leukemia. However, there are a few problems with this. For one, Carpenter also puts the confidence interval on his slide as well, and it says that the authors of the paper are only confident the real answer lies somewhere between 1 and 4. And if the real number is actually just 1, since this is really a small group of people, it was only about 40 adult cases, 8 child cases over an 11-year period, it's such a small sample that it's quite possible this group does not really represent the general statistics well. Even worse, the authors themselves stated explicitly that this study has limitations because of the small number of cases and the lack of exposure data. Although the data adds evidence of an excess of a leukemia in a population living near high-power radio transmitters, no causal implication can be drawn. So what this means is you've got someone who is arguing that cell phone radiation or radio tower radiation is a significant concern for human health. It's an epidemiological study. They're quoting it and making one claim saying, yes, the study shows that there's a problem, but then the authors themselves say that you can't draw any causal conclusion based on this research. So I think it's important to not just look at articles that people post or things that you see online, but to actually go back and look at the actual research papers, which is why I spent some time digging through the literature on this. So this brings me to another important point about the difference between causation and correlation. This is a common mistake or misnomer made in lots of conspiracy theories online, and in this particular paper, the authors clarified and stated explicitly that their results are not conclusive enough to draw any conclusion that the higher incidence of leukemia was in fact caused by proximity to the radio station. There's a nice website actually that illustrates how two things can be correlated, but that doesn't mean that they cause one another. I have no idea if any of the data that are on this particular website is even real, but that's actually besides the point because it could be. And regardless, it illustrates how two random and unconnected phenomena might exhibit the same trends, but that does not mean that one causes the other. So in this case, they observed some possible correlation between the proximity of a group of people to a radio station and the incidence of leukemia, but it does not necessarily mean that the proximity is what caused it. So Carpenter then cites another report by Ha and co-workers, again saying that there's more leukemia in children living closer to radio towers. This was a much bigger sample set with like 3,000 cases as opposed to the 8. And these cases were in Korea, and it concluded that it may be caused by proximity to the radio station. But when I looked at the data, the data doesn't really seem to support this conclusion. Again, Carpenter states that their confidence interval dips down to 1, so it's possible there's nothing to this at all. But then when I looked at their data, it really seems like they can't conclude much. So here's an image of the plots. For example, the plot of the odds ratio versus distance from the radio tower kind of looks like it gets lower as you go further away, which would be consistent with this hypothesis that the proximity to the radio signal is what's causing some kind of higher rate of cancer. But look at the lines above and below each point. These are what we call the error bars, or this quantifies the uncertainty associated with each of those calculations or each of those measurements. So it's totally possible that there is nothing to this at all, because you can see that the error bars, or the uncertainty, actually encompasses the value of 1 across the board. So it's possible that there is no particular higher odds of having cancer despite the location or proximity to the source. And so this is a good example of how it's totally possible that there's no problem at all, and it's important to acknowledge that there definitely could be an effect, but the research is inconclusive. You can't definitely say that there is. So then later on slide 14, he cites a large international study conducted by the World Health Organization, abbreviated WHO. When I read the WHO report, to me it seems like he mischaracterizes the report. This is what I was referring to earlier on as this notion of cherry picking the data. In his slide, he only focuses on the potentially suggestive result, but doesn't mention the others. So most of their study actually showed an odds ratio less than 1, meaning there's no effect from cell phone radiation, but the data that they had the least confidence in actually showed an odds ratio a little bit greater than 1. So he states that on his slide that these positive results were like hidden in an appendix, but when I read the report, the abstract, which is like on the very top in the very first page, clearly stated no increase in risk of glioma or meningioma was observed with the use of mobile phones, and the higher odds ratio was mentioned in the abstract. They said when the cumulative call time was greater than about 1,600 hours, or the odds ratio was 1.4 for glioma and 1.15 for meningioma. But there are implausible values reported of use in this group. So again, from reading the actual reports, there does not seem to be a strong consensus that there's actually a problem with cell phone radiation. And so this particular slide deck that I'm looking at here from Carpenter highlights this study as one that found some results that suggested or supported his hypothesis that there is a problem. But those were the results they were actually least confident in, because they're saying that when they actually interviewed people to look at how much they were using cell phones, the numbers they gave didn't make any sense. They said they had implausible amounts of cell phone use that didn't make sense, and so they put lower confidence on those results. So those are the things that again become concerning when you try to look at different experts claiming that there's some kind of problem here. Now, I don't want to pick on Carpenter or his work. I'm not trying to single him out, so to speak, but in my own independent review, I came to some different conclusions than he did. And there are others making claims that cell phone radiation is a problem, and specifically that 5G has not been studied. However, the main distinction of 5G is the usage of higher frequencies. And in this range of frequencies, lower frequencies penetrate further, and thus there's arguably a stronger case that 2G, 3G, or 4G should have had greater effect than 5G. And it should also be noted that there's been studies of the effects in the tens of gigahertz or hundreds of gigahertz range, which is where the 5G networks operate. So it's not like there's never been any study. It's not this unknown regime. For example, there was a really good review paper called Millimeter Wave Interactions with the Human Body, State of Knowledge and Recent Advances. And they cite a bunch of papers, and they're able to make some very broad, conclusive statements like exposure at 60 gigahertz is absorbed on the skin and the cornea of the eye. If you go to higher power densities than what the guidelines permit, like 3,000 milliwatts per square centimeter. Remember, the guideline is 1 milliwatt per square centimeter. Such high intensity exposure can cause lesions in the eye. So it's not to say that there is no value of amplitude that would cause a problem, or there is a power density that would cause a problem. But studies performed at 60 gigahertz and only 10 times higher than the guideline, so 10 milliwatts per square centimeter as opposed to 1 milliwatt per square centimeter. These studies demonstrated no detectable physiological modifications. They showed no effect. So even at 10 times higher than the guidelines already permit, they saw no effect. If you go 3,000 times larger, again, I said in the beginning, there's definitely some amplitude where you can cause a problem at virtually any frequency. The key question is we have to quantify what level of amplitude is that. So in conclusion, after reviewing some of the literature, and I by no means claim that my review is complete, I don't see any cause for alarm about 5G radiation or any other cell phone or Wi-Fi radiation for that matter. There's been lots of studies on these issues, and the long and short of it is that there just does not seem to be any very conclusive evidence to show that this is a problem. This doesn't mean that there isn't some level of an effect. It simply means that to date, there hasn't been a strong enough effect that we can reliably and repeatedly detect it. And actually, what makes me a bit confident in this statement, without having read more of the literature, is that I've looked at some of the authors who seem to be advocating strongly that this is a problem. And what I found particularly telling is that I have not seen anywhere that they have actually recommended any actual solutions. So I've seen claims, we should be alarmed. We shouldn't go at this blindly. There's no reason we should think this is safe without first checking. Okay, fair enough. But they argue we need stricter policies to limit our exposure. But I have not seen any suggestions for how much lower it should be. And part of the reason I think that there's no suggestion of how much lower it should be is particularly important to highlight is because I don't think they can make a recommendation on how much lower it should be, because they can't definitively show where there's an effect versus where there's not an effect. You can't just keep saying we need stricter rules, but because even if I believe you and I agree, okay, we should change the rules. The question is, should the radiation limit be 2 times lower, 10 times lower, 100 times lower? What number is safe? The fact that I have not yet seen a suggestion for a safe regime of operation, I think really highlights the fact that there isn't anything conclusive enough to support a recommendation like that. And so that's one of the concerning things that I've noticed in this field of research so far. So now, as I wrap this up, I want to give everyone a counterexample. For a moment, consider another case where there actually was a conspiracy to cover up scientific evidence. This was the case with smoking tobacco causing cancer. If you go and you look at the literature on this topic, it is a stark contrast to what you see with cell phones and 5G. First of all, it was very easy to find a good review article on this. And the article that I found cites a multitude of studies that show the effects are repeatable, they're harmful, they're statistically significant, meaning the confidence intervals, do not dip down to 1, and they state very plainly, very strong statements. Cigarette smoking causes 30% of all cancer death in more developed countries, right? The paper I found really quickly was entitled Cigarette Smoking and Lung Cancer, Chemical Mechanisms and Approaches to Prevention. In this paper, the authors explain not just epidemiological studies, okay, which essentially are showing correlation but not causation. They cite a number of biological papers that actually talk about what is physically happening. Why is it causing cancer? How is it causing cancer? This is in stark contrast to the cell phone and 5G research, which does not explain a mechanism conclusively. Instead, they just raise a lot of questions, a lot of possibilities, a lot of could-be's, maybes, we should look into this more. Instead of making statements about what might be happening, this paper states very clearly, among the 4,000 identified chemicals in cigarette smoke, more than 60 are established carcinogens, okay, according to assessments by the International Agency for Research on Cancer. these chemical carcinogens are the cause of cancer from cigarette smoke. That's definitive. That's conclusive. No question about it. Statements like this do not leave us hanging or uncertain, and they're backed up by an undeniable body of literature. So even though I can't say definitively cell phone radiation or 5G does not cause any problems, I concur with the ICNIRP statement that in effect says, in the case of potential long-term effects of exposure, such as increased risk of cancer, we have concluded that the available data is insufficient to provide a basis for setting exposure restrictions. Although epidemiological research has provided suggestive but unconvincing evidence of an association between possible carcinogenic effects. So just because you can show an association doesn't mean it's strong enough for us to be able to conclude and put a restriction, all right? So this is to say that we have no reason to believe that 5G or cell phone radiation is harmful. And this is a very different statement from saying conclusively that there is no harm. It is more accurate to say that we can't seem to prove either way. And it's possible that maybe there are effects, but they may be so small that they're statistically insignificant. We may never be able to actually conclude on this and say that there's harm or there isn't. I remember one paper arguing that in order to really understand this, you have to couple the effects of the radiation with other things like other toxins or chemicals that people are exposed to really see a bigger effect. And so there's still more to do on this, but it's not clear that you can attribute any problem specifically to cell phone radiation. So I'll end here with my own criteria for what would make me rethink what I've stated here. If somebody is able to show me some studies that meet the following criteria, I'd be prompted to reevaluate my perspective. Number one, I'd need to see a study that uses gigahertz frequencies relevant for 5G. Number two, the study needs to show some negative effects at or below the suggested thresholds of like 1 milliwatt per square centimeter. Okay. Number three, I'd like to see some non-epidemiological studies showing an actual causation instead of just correlation, and description of an actual mechanism. Something like maybe I saw it mentioned in a few places, the effect of reactive oxygen species. Show that in a very definitive way. Number four, I'd like to see a study show something in vivo, meaning actually exposing something living inside the organism rather than in vitro, where you might, for example, take some tissue, put it in a petri dish and expose it to radiation. This is because you might be able to show that there's some small effect, maybe messing up some DNA, but then the cells in a real organism may have a mechanism for repairing this, and that may not actually result in any real harm. Lastly, I'd like to see someone show an effect in humans versus animals, simply because the ability for this radiation to penetrate a human is likely going to be harder than something like a mouse or something smaller. So if a study can meet these criteria and really show some statistically significant negative effects, then I would definitely reevaluate my perspective. But for now, I don't get the impression that there's anything in the literature that does this. There's nothing that shows any strong evidence that we should have anything to be worried about or alarmed about at all. And I think that although there's a lot of attention given to this, there's been millions of dollars of research poured into studying this. From my perspective, concurs with that of the international organization, ICNIRP, that there's just not enough strong evidence that would lead one to draw a conclusion that there's definitely a problem or that we should set different restrictions or limits based on anything.